Please take care of my ma, sir. She's all I have now," whispered 8-year-old Sofia Vasquez to the silent Modoc chief, her tiny hands trembling as she clutched a blood-stained shawl. What followed was a story that would challenge everything. Two broken souls believed about family, forgiveness, and the courage it takes to love again in a land where survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant staying human. The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly in all directions. A biblical wasteland of sand, sage, and suffering under the merciless August sun of 1873. Heat waves shimmered like ghosts across the alkali flats, and the only sounds were the whisper of wind through Joshua trees and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
At 42, the Modoc warrior had shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his people's sorrow, hands scarred by war and weather, and eyes that held the deep silence of someone who had witnessed the end of worlds. His long black hair, streaked with premature silver, hung loose around a face carved by wind and marked by a jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of the cavalry saber that had taken his vision in one eye during the Modoc War 3 years earlier. He rode a paint horse whose ribs showed through patchy hide, both of them survivors of a conflict that had scattered his people like seeds on barren ground. The horse's hooves made soft percussion against the hardpan earth as Vicasa followed an ancient trail that his grandfather's grandfather had used to cross between the sacred places of his people. But those sacred places were gone now, turned into cattle ranches and mining claims, and Vicasa himself was a man without a tribe, without a home, without purpose beyond the simple act of continuing to breathe. The smell reached him first, the metallic tang of blood mixed with the sweet corruption of approaching death. His paint horse snorted and shied, but Vicasa urged the animal forward, following the scent through a grove of stunted cottonwoods that clustered around a nearly dry creek bed. What he found there made even his battle-hardened heart clench with recognition and rage. A covered wagon sat tilted at an unnatural angle, one wheel shattered, the canvas top torn and flapping in the desert wind like a wounded bird's wing. The oxen that had pulled it were gone, either dead or scattered, and the supplies that had once filled the wagon bed were strewn across the sand like the aftermath of a cyclone. But it was the woman lying in the wagon's shade that drew Vicasa's attention and held it with iron certainty. Helena Vasquez had once been beautiful in the way that desert flowers are beautiful, vibrant, and resilient, capable of blooming even in the harshest conditions. But the desert had been claiming her slowly, methodically, the way it claimed everything that wasn't strong enough to resist its hunger. Her long black hair, streaked with dust and matted with dried blood, framed a face that had been lovely before fever and pain had hollowed her cheeks and darkened the circles under her eyes. She wore the simple brown dress of a working woman, but it was torn and stained, and one sleeve had been ripped away to reveal a makeshift bandage around her upper arm that was soaked through with blood. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid, her skin burning with the kind of fever that meant infection had set deep roots. But what struck Vicasa most profoundly was not her condition. He had seen plenty of dying people in his lifetime, but the small figure crouched beside her like a guardian angel carved from determination and desperation. The little girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with her mother's dark hair and eyes the color of coffee beans. But where Helena was fading, Sofia blazed with fierce protective energy. Her small hands held a tin cup of precious water, and she was carefully dripping it between her mother's cracked lips while murmuring what sounded like prayers in a mixture of Spanish and English. Her own dress, once white with blue flowers, was now brown with dust and decorated with the kind of stains that came from caring for someone too sick to care for themselves. Vicasa dismounted slowly, his moccasins making no sound on the sand. The child looked up at his approach, and he saw no fear in her eyes, only a desperate, adult kind of hope that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She was far too young to wear such an expression, far too small to carry such responsibility. But the desert had a way of aging people before their time. "Senor," Sophia said in a voice that was steady despite everything. "Are you an angel?" The question hit Vikasa like a physical blow. Angel. If she only knew what his hands had done, what blood they had spilled, what villages had burned, because of orders he had carried out in the name of protecting his people. If she only knew that he was probably the furthest thing from an angel that the desert had ever produced. But looking down at her small, dirt-streaked face, at the hope burning in those coffee-dark eyes, he found he couldn't speak the truth. Instead, he knelt beside the wagon, bringing himself down to her level, and spoke in the careful English he had learned during his years as a liaison between his people and the white authorities. "I am Vikasa," he said simply. "What is your name?" "Little one?" "Sophia," she replied, never taking her eyes off his face. "Sophia Maria Vasquez." "This is my mama, Helena. She's very sick," said her, "very sick." Vikasa nodded, his trained warrior's eye taking in the scene with clinical precision. The woman's arm wound was infected, probably from a bullet that had grazed her during whatever attack had destroyed their wagon and scattered their supplies. The fever was high enough to be dangerous, and she had been unconscious long enough for serious dehydration to set in. Without immediate care, she would be dead by sunset, but it was more than medical assessment that moved him. Something about this small family's plight resonated in the hollow places of his heart where his own losses lived. His wife, Ayana, had died giving birth to their son during the winter of 1869. The boy, barely 2 years old, had succumbed to measles the following spring. In the space of 18 months, Vikasa had lost everything that made life worth living. And he had spent the 3 years since then wandering the desert like a ghost, existing, but not truly alive. "How long has she been like this?" he asked Sophia, reaching out to touch Elena's forehead with the back of his hand. The heat radiating from her skin confirmed his fears about the fever. "2 days, Sophia replied, her voice starting to crack with exhaustion, maybe 3. The bad men came and shot up our wagon. Mama got hurt trying to protect me. She told me to hide under the wagon until they left, and when I came out, she was bleeding and talking strange." "What bad men?" Sophia's small face hardened with an anger that was shocking in someone so young. "Banditos. They wanted our money, our food, our horses. Mama told them we didn't have much, but they didn't believe her. One of them grabbed me, and that's when Mama fought them. That's when they shot her." Vikasa felt the familiar cold rage settle in his chest, the same fury that had driven him through years of warfare against the expanding white settlements. But this time, the anger was mixed with something else, something warmer and more protective. This child and her mother were not his enemies. They were simply people trying to survive in a land that seemed determined to kill everything beautiful and innocent that entered its boundaries. "Where were you going?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Most wagon trains that crossed this part of the Mojave were heading for California, chasing dreams of gold or fertile farmland. "Los Angeles," Sophia said. "Mama said we were going to start a new life there. After Papa died, there was nothing left for us in Texas except debts and sad memories. Mama sold everything we had to buy this wagon and supplies for the journey." "Your father?" "Killed in the war," Sophia said with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children develop when tragedy becomes commonplace. "He was a veterano, but when the fighting started, he joined the Texas Rangers. A Confederate bullet found him at the Battle of Galveston. Mama said he died protecting what he believed in, but I think he just died." The simplicity of her statement cut deeper than any elaborate eulogy could have.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Vikasa understood that kind of loss, that sense of a world suddenly emptied of meaning. He also understood the desperate courage it must have taken for Helena to load her child into a wagon and head west toward an uncertain future. It was the kind of bravery that came from having no other choices left. "Señor Vikasa," Sophia said. And her voice was very small now, very young. "I think my mama is dying." The words hung in the desert air like a prayer and a curse combined. Vikasa looked down at Helena's face, at the gray pallor creeping around her lips and the too rapid flutter of her pulse in her throat. The child was right. Without intervention, Helena Vasquez would not see another sunrise, but intervention meant commitment. It meant allowing these strangers into what remained of his carefully guarded solitude. It meant risking the kind of emotional connection that could lead to the kind of loss that had nearly destroyed him 3 years ago. Every rational part of his mind told him to ride away, to leave these people to their fate the way the desert left everyone to their fate eventually. Instead, he found himself reaching for Helena's wrist, checking her pulse with gentle fingers while Sophia watched with desperate attention. "Can you help her?" Sophia asked, and there was something in her voice, not just hope, but a kind of absolute trust that Vikasa hadn't heard directed at him in years. "Please, Señor, she's all I have left in the whole world." The trust in those words broke something loose in Vikasa's chest, some barrier he had built around his heart to keep out exactly this kind of pain. He looked down at this small girl who was offering him her complete faith, despite knowing nothing about him except his name, and he made a decision that would change the course of 3 lives forever. "Yes," he said simply, "I can help her. But we must move quickly." Sophia's face lit up with relief so profound that it was painful to witness. She threw her small arms around Vikasa's neck with a ferocity that surprised him, and for a moment he allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be someone's hero instead of someone's enemy. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Vikasa gently disentangled himself from her embrace and began to assess what needed to be done. Helena's wound would need to be cleaned and properly dressed. Her fever would need to be brought down with cool water and the willow bark tea he carried in his medicine pouch. Most importantly, she would need to be moved to a place where she could rest and recover safely. "Sophia," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had once used to command warriors in battle, "I need you to be very brave and very helpful. Can you do that?" The little girl nodded eagerly, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Good. First we must gather what we can from your wagon. Food, blankets, anything that might be useful. Then we will take your mother to a place where she can heal." "Where?" Sophia asked, looking around at the empty desert that stretched to every horizon. "I know a place," Vikasa said, and for the first time in 3 years, he was thinking of his hidden camp not as a refuge from the world, but as a sanctuary for those who needed protection from it. A place where the water runs clean and the shade runs deep. A place where your mother can rest until she is strong again. As he lifted Helena's unconscious form from the wagon bed, marveling at how light she felt, how fragile, Vikasa caught Sophia, watching him with those serious dark eyes. "Señor Vikasa," she said quietly, "why are you helping us? You don't even know us." It was a fair question, and one that Vikasa wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Why was he helping them? Because they reminded him of his own lost family? Because the child's courage in the face of disaster moved something in his warrior's heart? Because 3 years of solitude had finally worn down his defenses against human connection? "Because," he said finally, settling Helena's unconscious form across his horse's back while Sophia gathered their meager remaining supplies, "sometimes the desert sends us what we need most when we think we need nothing at all." Sophia considered this with the gravity of someone much older than 8 years. Then she nodded as if his answer made perfect sense. "Is that why you came to us today?" she asked. Because the desert sent you? Vikasa mounted his horse carefully, making sure Helena was secure before reaching down to pull Sophia up behind him. As they rode away from the destroyed wagon, leaving behind the wreckage of one life and heading toward the uncertain promise of another, he found himself thinking about the child's question. Had the desert sent him to them? Or had it sent them to him? In his culture, such distinctions mattered less than the recognition that some meetings were ordained by forces larger than human understanding. What mattered was that he had found them, or they had found him, and now their fates were braided together like strands of rope that would either support each other or break under the weight of what was to come. Behind him, Sophia wrapped her small arms around his waist and pressed her face against his back, trusting him completely to carry her and her mother to safety. Ahead of them, the desert stretched on toward the mountains where Vikasa had built his hidden refuge, and for the first time in 3 years, he was not riding toward solitude, but away from it. As Helena's fever-bright dreams mixed with the rhythm of the horse's gait and Sophia's whispered prayers, none of them could have known that this rescue would become something much more dangerous and much more precious than simple charity. They could not have foreseen the choices that lay ahead, the enemies that would emerge from their past, or the way 3 broken hearts might heal each other if they were brave enough to try. All they knew was that the desert had brought them together. And for now, that was enough. The hidden canyon that Vikasa called home revealed itself gradually, like a secret the desert had been keeping for centuries. After 3 hours of riding through increasingly rugged terrain, they descended through a narrow cleft between towering red sandstone walls that seemed to close overhead like protective hands. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the canyon's embrace, and the sound of running water grew stronger with each step. The paint horse took deeper into this natural sanctuary. Sophia had dozed against Vikasa's back during the journey, her small body finally succumbing to exhaustion after days of caring for her mother alone. But she stirred as they emerged into a hidden valley that seemed to exist outside the harsh realities of the Mojave Desert. A crystal-clear stream wound through the canyon floor, fed by springs that bubbled up from deep underground. Cottonwoods and willows created pools of green shade, and grass grew thick along the water's edge. Ancient petroglyphs covered the canyon wall spirals and human figures and animal shapes that spoke of peoples who had found sanctuary here long before the first European had ever dreamed of crossing the great waters. "It's beautiful," Sophia whispered, her voice filled with wonder as she took in the impossible oasis hidden within the desert's heart. "It's like a fairy tale." Vikasa felt a flicker of pride at her reaction. He had discovered this place during his wandering after the war, drawn by the same springs that had sustained his ancestors during their seasonal migrations. Over the past 3 years, he had gradually transformed it into a refuge that met all his needs for solitude and survival. A lean-to shelter built against the canyon wall provided protection from storms. Carefully tended plots grew corn, beans, and squash in the traditional Three Sisters formation his grandmother had taught him. Fish traps in the stream ensured a steady supply of protein, and the canyon's natural barriers made it invisible to casual travelers and military patrols alike. But more than its practical advantages, this place had become his sanctuary from a world that seemed determined to destroy everything he had ever loved. Here, surrounded by the voices of his ancestors and the timeless rhythm of flowing water, he had slowly learned to live with the ghosts that haunted him. Here, he had thought he might spend the rest of his days in the kind of peace that comes from expecting nothing and wanting nothing. Now, as he carefully lifted Helena's unconscious form from the horse's back, he wondered if that peace had been an illusion all along. Perhaps the desert had been preparing him for this moment, teaching him solitude so that he would understand the true value of connection when it finally found him again. Helena's condition had worsened during the journey. Her skin burned with fever, and she had begun making small, distressed sounds in her delirium fragments of Spanish and English that spoke of pain and fear and desperate love for the daughter who depended on her. Vicasa carried her to the lean-to shelter and laid her gently on the bed of furs and woven blankets that had been his alone for 3 years. "Will she be all right?" Sophia asked, hovering anxiously as Vicasa began examining her mother's wounded arm. The infection had spread beyond the original bullet graze, and red streaks were beginning to climb toward Alana's shoulder, a sign that the poison in her blood was advancing with deadly purpose. "She is very sick," Vicasa said honestly, unwrapping the crude bandage that Sophia had fashioned from torn petticoat fabric. "But the spirits of this place are strong. They have healing power for those who need it most." The wound was worse than he had feared. The bullet had torn through the muscle of Elena's upper arm, and the rough treatment during her days of delirium had prevented proper healing. Infection had taken hold with the tenacity of a predator, and Vicasa could smell the sweet, sickening scent of tissue beginning to die. But he had treated worse wounds during the war. He had learned the healing arts from his grandmother, who had been the most respected medicine woman among the Modoc people, and he had expanded that knowledge through necessity during years of conflict. More importantly, he had learned that healing required more than just medicine. It required the kind of fierce determination that he could see burning in Sophia's dark eyes. "I need you to help me," he told the little girl as he began gathering supplies from his carefully organized stores. "Your mother's spirit is fighting to stay with you, but her body needs our help to win that fight." Sophia nodded gravely, rolling up her sleeves with the businesslike efficiency of someone who had already proven she could handle adult responsibilities. "What do you need me to do?" "First, we must clean the wound properly. That means removing all the infected tissue, even if it hurts her. Then we must draw the poison from her blood using plants that grow here in the canyon. Finally, we must keep her cool and give her body the strength to heal itself." As Vicasa built up the fire and began heating water in a metal pot he had traded for years earlier, he found himself studying Sophia from the corner of his eye. The child moved with a competence that spoke of having been her mother's helper long before their current crisis. She sorted through the supplies they had salvaged from the wagon without being asked, setting aside items that might be useful and organizing the rest. Her movements were economical and purposeful, wasting no effort on unnecessary emotion or panic. "You have done this before," he observed as she efficiently arranged their meager possessions. "Cared for someone who is sick." Sophia's hands stilled for a moment before continuing their work. "Mama got the lung fever last winter. I took care of her then too. Papa had been dead for 6 months, and we had no money for a doctor. I learned to make teas and poultices from Senora Martinez, who lived next to us. She said I had good hands for healing." "Senora Martinez was right," Vicasa said, impressed by the matter-of-fact way Sophia spoke about responsibilities that would have crushed many adults. "Your mother is fortunate to have you." "She's all I have," Sophia said simply, and there was something in her voice, not self-pity, but a kind of absolute clarity about what mattered most in her world. "If she dies, I have nowhere to go, nobody to take care of me." "The church orphanage in Texas. Mama said she'd rather die than see me end up there." The words hit Vicasa with unexpected force. He understood that kind of desperate love, the willingness to risk everything rather than lose the person who made life worth living. He had felt the same fierce protectiveness toward his own family, and the failure to save them had carved a hollow place in his heart that 3 years of solitude had not been able to fill. But looking at Sophia's determined face as she prepared to help him fight for her mother's life, he felt something shift in that hollow place. Not healing, exactly, but the possibility of healing. The recognition that love might be worth the risk of loss, even when loss had nearly destroyed him before. "Then we will make sure she does not die," he said with quiet conviction. "Your mother is stronger than she looks, and you are braver than most warriors I have known. Together, we will bring her back." The process of cleaning Helena's wound was brutal and necessary. Vikasa worked with the steady precision of someone who had performed surgery under combat conditions, cutting away infected tissue while Sofia held her mother's head and whispered soothing words in Spanish. Helena's unconscious body fought against the pain, and twice she nearly awakened, her eyes fluttering open to reveal confusion and fever-bright distress before sliding closed again. "She's dreaming," Sofia said during one of these episodes, smoothing damp hair back from her mother's forehead. "She always talks in her sleep when she's worried about something. Right now she's probably dreaming about Papa, wondering if she made the right choice leaving Texas. What do you think?" Vikasa asked as he prepared a poultice from herbs he had gathered in the canyon willow bark for the fever, echinacea root for infection, and sweet flag to strengthen her blood. Did she make the right choice? Sofia considered the question with the gravity she brought to everything important. "I think she made the only choice she could. After Papa died, the bank wanted to take our house for the debts he left behind. Mama could have married Senator Herrera, he asked her 3 times, but she said she wasn't ready to belong to another man yet. She said sometimes a woman has to choose between being safe and being free, and she chose free. Even though it meant danger for both of you? Especially because it meant danger for both of us," Sofia said fiercely. "Mama always said that a life lived in fear isn't really living at all. She said Papa wouldn't want us to spend the rest of our lives hiding from the world because we were afraid something bad might happen to us." Vikasa found himself thinking about those words as he applied the poultice to Helena's wounded arm and wrapped it with clean cloth torn from his own spare shirt. A life lived in fear isn't really living at all. For 3 years, he had been existing rather than living, hiding in this canyon from a world that had taken everything he loved. But perhaps isolation was just another kind of fear, the fear of caring enough about someone to risk losing them again. As evening settled over the canyon, and the first stars began to appear in the narrow strip of sky visible between the red rock walls, Helena's fever finally began to break. Color returned to her cheeks, and her breathing deepened into the natural rhythm of healing sleep rather than the shallow gasps of delirium. "She's better," Sofia said with relief so profound it made her voice shake. "I can tell. Her skin doesn't feel like fire anymore." "The healing has begun," Vikasa agreed, banking the fire for the night. "But it will take time for her strength to return. Days, perhaps weeks before she's ready to travel again." Sofia looked up at him with sudden worry. Is it all right for us to stay here that long? We don't want to be a burden to you." The question revealed the careful politeness that had been bred into her by a mother who understood that a woman traveling alone with a child had to be grateful for any kindness and careful not to overstay her welcome. But it also revealed something else, the assumption that their presence here was temporary, that once Helena recovered, they would move on to whatever destiny awaited them in California. Vikasa found himself reluctant to confirm that assumption. Over the course of this single day, these 2 strangers had brought something into his carefully ordered solitude that he hadn't even realized he was missing. The sound of Sofia's voice as she sang softly to her mother. The sense of purpose that came from using his skills to save a life rather than simply maintaining his own existence. The feeling that this hidden canyon was becoming a home again rather than just a hiding place. "You are not a burden," he said finally. "This place has been empty too long. Perhaps it was waiting for the right people to fill it again." Sofia studied his face in the firelight with the penetrating gaze of someone much older than her years. "Are you lonely, Senator Vikasa? Is that why you live out here all by yourself?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. Adults had learned to dance around such personal inquiries, but children often asked the exact questions that adults were too polite or too frightened to voice. "I thought I preferred being alone," he said carefully. After my family died, being around other people felt difficult. Everyone wanted to offer sympathy or advice, but what I really needed was silence. Time to figure out how to live with the empty places they left behind. Did you figure it out? Vicasa looked across the fire at this serious little girl who was asking him to account for 3 years of carefully constructed solitude, and realized he didn't have a good answer. Had he figured out how to live with loss, or had he simply found a way to avoid living altogether? I thought I had, he said honestly. But today, watching you take care of your mother, seeing how much you love her, even when you're afraid, it made me remember that some things are worth the risk of losing them. Sophia nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. Mama says that love is like planting seeds. You never know which ones will grow, but if you don't plant any seeds at all, you'll never have a garden. The simple wisdom of Helena's words, filtered through her daughter's understanding, hit Vicasa with unexpected power. For 3 years, he had been living in a barren landscape of his own making, too afraid of loss to risk planting any new seeds of connection. But these two strangers had arrived in his life like desert rain, sudden, unexpected, and full of the possibility for growth in places that had seemed too damaged to support life. As Sophia curled up beside her sleeping mother, using Vicasa's extra blanket and pillowing her head on the small bundle of their remaining possessions, he found himself standing guard over them both with a protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. He had not chosen to become responsible for their safety, but somehow that responsibility had chosen him. The canyon was quiet except for the eternal murmur of running water and the distant call of a night bird somewhere high on the rim. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the air carried the sweet scent of night-blooming desert flowers. It was the same sanctuary where Vicasa had spent 1,000 solitary nights, but tonight it felt completely different. Tonight it felt alive with possibility. Helena stirred in her sleep, murmuring something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer or a promise. Sophia's small hand found her mother's arm, and even in sleep, her protective instincts kept her connected to the person who mattered most in her world. Watching them, Vicasa felt the careful walls he had built around his heart beginning to crack. Not breaking, exactly, but developing the kind of fractures that let light in. He had spent 3 years learning to live without love, but perhaps it was time to remember how to live with it again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Helena's recovery would be slow and uncertain. Questions would need to be answered about their future, about whether this temporary sanctuary could become something more permanent. And somewhere beyond the canyon's protective walls, the dangerous world that had already tried to destroy this small family would continue to pose threats that a lone Mogak warrior might not be able to face alone. But tonight, as he settled down to keep watch over two people who had somehow become precious to him in the space of a single day, Vicasa allowed himself to hope that the desert's gift might be exactly what all three of them needed to heal the wounds that life had carved in their hearts. The fire burned low, painting dancing shadows on the canyon walls where ancient spirits had once recorded their own stories of survival and connection. And in that timeless place where past and present converged, three broken souls began the slow, dangerous work of learning to trust each other with their deepest fears and most fragile hopes. 2 weeks had passed since Vicasa carried Helena and Sophia into the hidden canyon, and the transformation in all three of them was remarkable. Helena's fever had broken completely on the 4th day, and by the end of the first week, she was sitting up and taking solid food. The infection in her arm had retreated under Vicasa's careful treatment, leaving behind healthy pink scar tissue. That would always mark where death had come calling, but failed to collect its due. But the changes went deeper than physical healing. The canyon itself seemed to have awakened from a long slumber. Sophia's laughter echoed off the red rock walls as she discovered tadpoles, in the quiet pools, and learned to identify the different bird calls that announced dawn and dusk. Helena, as her strength returned, had begun contributing to their small community in ways that surprised even her, mending Vicasa's worn clothing with neat, nearly invisible stitches, organizing their shared supplies with an efficiency that tripled their usefulness, and cooking meals over the fire that transformed simple ingredients into feasts that made the canyon feel like a true home. And Vicasa found himself changing in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. The rigid routine that had governed his solitary existence had evolved into something more flexible, more alive. Instead of silent contemplation at dawn, he now woke to Sophia's excited whispers as she pointed out tracks in the sand or clouds that looked like animals. Instead of eating alone, he shared meals filled with conversation and laughter. Instead of falling asleep to the sound of his own breathing, he listened to Helena humming Spanish lullabies to her daughter, melodies that seemed to carry all the warmth and safety that home was supposed to provide. But it was the growing connection between him and Helena that proved most unsettling to his carefully guarded heart. She was nothing like his late wife Ayana, who had been born to the traditional ways of their people and had moved through life with the quiet grace of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. Helena was fire where Ayana had been. Water, passionate, determined, unafraid to speak her mind or challenge his assumptions about how things should be done. "You're burning the coffee again," she said on this particular morning, appearing at his elbow with the silent step she had learned from watching him move through the canyon. Her dark hair was braided back in a practical style that emphasized the strong lines of her face, and she wore one of his spare shirts over her mended dress, a combination that should have looked strange but somehow made her appear perfectly at home in their wilderness sanctuary. "I prefer it strong," Vicasa replied, though they both knew he had been distracted by watching her teach Sophia to weave grass baskets using techniques she had learned from her grandmother in Mexico. "Strong, yes, burn, no." Helena took the pot from his hands with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over the past weeks. "Sophia and I have been talking." The words carried a weight that made Vicasa look up from the cornbread he was mixing for breakfast. In his experience, when women announced they had been talking, it usually meant decisions had been made that would require him to adjust his understanding of how the world worked. About what? About staying. Helena met his eyes directly, her expression serious but not apologetic. About making this permanent instead of temporary. Vicasa's hands stilled in their work. They had been carefully avoiding this conversation for days, even though it had hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that refused to die down. He had known it would come eventually, the moment when they would have to decide whether what they had built together was real enough to last, or just a pleasant interlude before returning to their separate struggles for survival. The original plan was Los Angeles, he said carefully. The original plan was escape, Helena corrected. Los Angeles was just a destination, a place to run to when we couldn't stay where we were. But this, she gestured toward the canyon walls, toward Sophia, who was chattering excitedly to herself as she worked on her basket, toward the garden plots and the neat shelter and all the signs of a life being built rather than simply endured. This feels like arriving somewhere instead of running toward something. Before Vicasa could respond, Sophia appeared at Helena's side, holding up her partially completed basket with pride. "Look, Mama, I did the whole bottom by myself, just like you showed." "Mva. It's beautiful, Mia," Helena said, examining the basket with the serious attention that made Sophia glow with accomplishment. "Strong and even. Your abuela would be proud. Can I show Vicasa?" Sophia asked, and without waiting for permission, she carried her handiwork to where he stood frozen in the middle of a conversation that felt like it was about to change everything. "Very good work," he said, accepting the basket and running his fingers over the tight, even weaves. "You have learned quickly." "Mama says I have good hands for making things," Sophia said proudly. Like you do. She says maybe you could teach. And me to make some of the things you make, like those fish traps, or the way you carve those bowls from wood. The casual assumption that he would be around long enough to teach her such things hit Vikasa with unexpected force. Somehow, without him noticing, this temporary arrangement had transformed in the minds of both mother and daughter into something that looked remarkably like a family. "Sophia," Helena said gently, "why don't you take your basket down to the stream and see if you can catch some of those little fish for lunch? Use the net Vikasa made for you." Sophia nodded eagerly and skipped off toward the water, leaving the two adults alone with a conversation that had suddenly become much more complicated. "She thinks of you as her father now," Helena said quietly, watching her daughter disappear around a bend in the stream. "Not to replace her papa, she still talks about him, still misses him. But she thinks of you as the man who takes care of us now, the man who keeps us safe. Helena, I know it's not what you planned," she continued, her voice steady but her hands betraying nervousness as they smoothed her skirt. "I know you didn't ask for the responsibility of a ready-made family. But the truth is, I've never felt safer anywhere than I do here with you. And Sophia ... She's been carrying the weight of protecting me for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be a child. You gave that back to her." Vikasa looked toward the stream where Sophia's voice could be heard singing this Spanish song he didn't recognize. Something bright and joyful that spoke of a little girl who no longer had to be afraid. The sound did something to his chest, loosened something that had been tight and guarded for 3 long years. "What are you asking me?" he said finally. Helena stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to smell the scent of sage and smoke that clung to her hair. "I'm asking if you think what we have here is worth making permanent. If you think 3 people who've all lost their families might be able to make a new one together." The question hung in the morning air like a prayer waiting for an answer. Vikasa found himself thinking about the past 2 weeks, about how the canyon had come alive with voices and laughter, about how he had begun looking forward to each day instead of simply enduring it. He thought about Sophia's trust and Helena's strength, and the way they had both somehow slipped past his defenses without him noticing. But before he could answer, the sound of horses approaching from the canyon's entrance made them both freeze. In 2 weeks, they had seen no other human beings, and visitors to this hidden place could only mean one thing: trouble. "Take Sophia and get to the shelter," Vikasa said quietly, his voice instantly shifting to the tone of command he had used during the war. "Stay hidden until I know who they are and what they want." Helena nodded without argument, understanding immediately that their peaceful interlude might be about to end. She moved swiftly toward the stream, calling Sophia back with a tone that brooked no delay. Wics, reached for the rifle he always kept within reach and positioned himself behind a large boulder that gave him a clear view of the canyon entrance while providing cover. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 riders emerged from the narrow passage, and even at a distance, Vikasa could see they were not casual travelers. They moved with the predatory confidence of men who were used to taking what they wanted, and their eyes swept the canyon with the calculating gaze of hunters who had found promising tracks. The leader was a tall, lean man with pale eyes and a carefully groomed beard that couldn't quite hide the cruel set of his mouth. He wore the kind of expensive clothes that suggested money and influence, but his hands rested on his gun handles with the easy familiarity of someone who preferred violence to negotiation. Behind him rode 2 men who were clearly hired muscle, thick-bodied and hard-faced, the kind of men who asked no questions as long as their pay was regular and their targets were defenseless. Well, the leader called out in a voice that carried clearly across the canyon. "What have we here?" "A little love nest tucked away where nobody would think to look." Vikasa remained silent, watching as the 3 men dismounted and began examining the signs of habitation with professional interest. They noted the garden plots, the fish traps, the carefully organized living area that spoke of people who intended to stay rather than just pass through. "I know you're here, Helena," the leader continued, his voice taking on a mocking sing-song quality. "You and that little brat of yours. Did you really think you could run far enough to get away from your obligations?" Helena's obligations. The words hit Vikasa like physical blows as understanding crashed over him. These men weren't random bandits or bounty hunters. They were here specifically for Helena and Sophia, which meant there was more to their story than he had been told. Come out, wherever you are," one of the hired men called, laughing at his own wit. "We're not going away until we get what we came for." From his hiding place, Vikasa could see Helena's face go white with a fear that was deeper than simple terror. This was the fear of someone confronting a nightmare she had thought she had escaped, and it told him everything he needed to know about why she and Sophia had really been fleeing across the desert. 30 seconds, the leader announced, pulling his pocket watch with theatrical precision. "Then we start shooting up this pretty little paradise until you decide to be reasonable." Vikasa made his decision with the instant clarity that had kept him alive through years of warfare. He stepped out from behind the boulder, rifle trained on the leader's chest, and spoke in the calm, deadly voice he had perfected during his years. "As a war chief, you're trespassing on sacred ground," he said. "Leave now, and you might live to see sunset." The three men turned toward him with the swift, coordinated movement of a pack that had hunted together before. But instead of alarm, Vikasa saw calculation in their eyes, the quick assessment of predators who were trying to determine whether this new threat was worth their concern. "Well, hello there, Chief," the leader said with exaggerated friendliness. "Didn't expect to find any of your kind still lurking around these parts. Thought the army had cleaned most of you out after that unpleasantness up at Captain Jack's stronghold." The reference to the Modoc War made Vikasa's jaw clench, but he kept his expression neutral. "This is your only warning." "Oh, I don't think so," the leader replied, his hand moving closer to his gun. "You see, we're here on business. Official business, you might say. That woman you're harboring? She stole something that doesn't belong to her, and we're here to collect it. The only thing here that doesn't belong is you," Vikasa said flatly. The leader's facade of civility finally cracked, revealing the ugly violence beneath. "Listen, you red-skinned." He never finished the sentence. Vikasa's rifle spoke with the authority of perfectly aimed gunpowder, and the leader's hat flew off his head, perforated by a bullet that had passed close enough to part his hair. "The next one won't miss," Vikasa said calmly, already working the lever to chamber another round. For a moment, the canyon was completely silent except for the eternal murmur of running water and the sharp breathing of three men who had suddenly realized they might have seriously underestimated their opposition. "You think you can take all three of us?" one of the hired guns asked, his voice tight with nervous bravado. "I think I've already killed more men than you've ever seen," Vikasa replied with matter-of-fact honesty. "The question is whether you're smart enough to leave before I demonstrate exactly how many more I'm willing to kill." From somewhere behind him, Helena's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Let them go, Rodrigo. This doesn't have to end in blood." So the leader had a name, Rodrigo, and Helena knew him well enough to believe she could reason with him, which meant their connection went deeper than Vikasa had initially understood. "Doesn't have to end in blood?" Rodrigo laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You killed my brother, Helena. You put a knife in his back and took what wasn't yours. Did you think I'd just forget about that?" The pieces of Helena's story began falling into place with sickening clarity. The banditos who had attacked their wagon hadn't been random raiders. They had been sent by someone with a personal grudge, someone who wanted Helena for reasons that went beyond simple robbery. "Diego tried to rape me," Helena said, stepping into view with Sophia pressed close against her side. "I defended myself and my daughter. If that makes me a killer, then I'll wear the title proudly. You were his woman, Rodrigo snarled. He had rights. I was never his woman, Helena shot back with fierce pride. I was his employee, nothing more. When my husband died and left us with debts, your brother offered me work in his cantina. I washed dishes and served drinks, and I thought that was all he expected, but when he decided he wanted more— You should have been grateful, Rodrigo interrupted. Diego could have provided for you and the brat. Instead, you murdered him and stole the money from his safe. I took what he owed me. In wages, Helena corrected. Wages he'd been holding back to keep me dependent on him. I took enough to buy passage to California, nothing more. Lying whore, one of the hired guns muttered, and Vicasa's rifle swung toward him with deadly intent. Watch your mouth, Vicasa said quietly, or I'll close it permanently. The standoff stretched out like a held breath. 4 men with guns and a woman with a daughter who had already paid too high a price for trying to build a life free from the violence that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Finally, Rodrigo seemed to reach some internal decision. He gestured to his men, and they began backing toward their horses with the careful movements of predators, temporarily retreating, but not abandoning the hunt. This isn't over, Helena, he called as they mounted up. I'll be back, and next time, I won't come alone. You can hide behind your pet Indian for now, but Diego's blood demands payment, and I always collect what's owed to my family. If you come back here, Vicasa said with deadly calm, I'll kill you. All of you. That's not a threat, it's a promise. Rodrigo's answering laugh was ugly with promised violence. We'll see about that, Chief. We'll see about that. The 3 riders disappeared back through the canyon entrance, leaving behind a silence that felt fragile and temporary. Vicasa kept his rifle ready until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely, then finally allowed himself to breathe normally. Helena was shaken not with fear, but with the aftermath of adrenaline and fury. Sophia clung to her mother's skirt, her dark eyes wide with the knowledge that their sanctuary had been discovered and their safety was once again in jeopardy. I'm sorry, Helena said, her voice thick with unshed tears. I should have told you. Everything from the beginning. About Diego, about why we were really running. I should have. You should have trusted me, Vicasa interrupted gently. But I understand why you didn't. Fear makes us all careful with the truth. They'll be back, Helena continued, ignoring his attempt at comfort. Rodrigo won't give up. He spent months tracking us down, and now that he knows where we are, then we'll be ready for them, Vicasa said with quiet conviction. This canyon has more secrets than they know, and I have more friends than they've counted on. Helena looked at him with surprise and hope warring in her expression. You still want us to stay? Even knowing what kind of danger we've brought to your doorstep? Vicasa looked down at Sophia, who was watching him with the absolute trust that had become precious beyond measure. He thought about the question Helena had asked him before Rodrigo's arrival, whether 3 people who had lost their families might be able to make a new one together. The arrival of external threats had changed nothing about his answer. If anything, it had clarified what he had been too afraid to admit. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, Helena and Sophia had stopped being refugees he was helping and had become family he was protecting. The danger was always there, he said finally. Now we just know what form it's going to take. And yes, I still want you to stay, both of you, for as long as you'll have me. Helena's tears finally spilled over, but they were tears of relief rather than fear. Sophia broke away from her mother's side and threw herself into Vicasa's arms, with the complete confidence of a child who knew she was loved and protected. Does this mean we're a real family now? She asked, her voice muffled against his chest. Vicasa looked over her head at Helena, who was watching them both with an expression of love so fierce and grateful that it took his breath away. Yes, little one, he said softly. We're a real family now. And real families protect each other, no matter what comes. The canyon walls seemed to echo with his words, as if the ancient spirits who watched over this place were adding their blessing to the vows being spoken. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers, but tonight, 3 souls who had been lost in different ways had finally found their way home to each other. And sometimes, that was enough to face whatever storm was coming. 3 days after Rodrigo's threatening visit, the hidden canyon had transformed into something resembling a military encampment. The casa moved through their sanctuary with the purposeful intensity of a war chief preparing for siege. But this time he wasn't fighting for abstract concepts like territory or honor. He was fighting for the 2 people who had become his entire world. The change in him was remarkable to witness. Gone was the contemplative hermit who had spent 3 years avoiding human connection. In his place stood a warrior whose tactical mind was operating at full capacity, calculating angles of attack, defensive positions, and escape routes with the cold precision that had made him legendary among both allies and enemies during the Modoc War. But it was Helena's transformation that proved most surprising. The grateful refugee who had accepted his help with humble gratitude had revealed herself to be a woman of steel wrapped in velvet. She worked alongside him with grim determination, learning to load and fire his spare rifle, memorizing the canyon's hidden paths, and discussing defensive strategies with a strategic understanding that spoke of hard-won experience with violence. "The narrow entrance is our greatest advantage," she said, studying the rough map the casa had drawn in the sand with a stick. 3 men can't charge through that passage without exposing themselves completely. But it's also our greatest weakness if they decide to wait us out. "They won't wait," the casa replied, adding marks to indicate the best firing positions among the rocks. Rodrigo's type doesn't have patience for siege warfare. He'll try to overwhelm us with speed and numbers. "Numbers," Helena repeated thoughtfully. "He said he wouldn't come alone next time. How many men do you think he can gather?" The casa considered the question while Sofia played with her doll nearby, seemingly oblivious to the deadly calculations her guardians were making. The child's innocence in the midst of their war preparations served as a constant reminder of what they were fighting to protect. "Depends on how much money he has and how badly he wants revenge," the casa said finally. "Men like Rodrigo usually travel with hired guns who fight for pay, not loyalty. If he can afford 6 or 8 shooters, we'll have real problems. Then we need to even the odds before they arrive." Helena's words carried a weight that made Vicasa look up from his map. There was something in her voice, a hardness that spoke of decisions being made and lines being drawn. "What are you thinking?" Helena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns in the sand that had nothing to do with defensive positions. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of desperate determination. "I'm thinking that maybe it's time to stop running and start hunting." The suggestion hung in the air between them like gunsmoke, dangerous and acrid. Vicasa had been thinking the same thing, that waiting for Rodrigo to choose the time and manner of their confrontation gave the enemy too many advantages. But hearing Helena's voice, the thought made him realize how far she had traveled from the frightened woman he had rescued in the desert. "Hunting is dangerous when you don't know the terrain," he said carefully. "And we don't know how many men he's gathered or where he's making camp. But we know where he'll go first," Helena countered. "Millbrook. It's the closest settlement, and Rodrigo will need supplies and information before he comes back here. Men like him always make the same mistake. They assume everyone can be bought or intimidated." Sofia looked up from her doll, her dark eyes moving between the 2 adults with the sharp attention of a child who had learned to read danger in grown-up conversations. "Are the bad men coming back?" she asked with the matter-of-fact directness that never failed to catch them off guard. Helena and Vicasa exchanged glances, each waiting for the other to decide how much truth an 8-year-old could handle. "Maybe," Helena said finally. That's why we're making plans to keep ourselves safe. Are you going to kill them? Sophia asked, and there was no fear in her voice, only the practical curiosity of someone who had already seen too much of the world's violence to be shocked by the prospect of more. Only if they force us to, Vikasa replied with careful honesty. Sometimes good people have to fight bad people to protect the things they love. Sophia nodded as if this made perfect sense to her, then returned to her doll with the resilience that had carried her through everything else life had thrown at her small shoulders. She's too young to understand concepts like necessary violence, Helena murmured, watching her daughter play. She understands survival, Vikasa corrected, and she understands love. Those are the only concepts that matter right now. As evening settled over the canyon, they made their decision. Helena would ride to Millbrook the next morning, ostensibly to purchase supplies, but actually to gather information about Rodrigo's movements and plans. Her appearance as a lone woman with a child would attract less suspicion than Vikasa's presence, and her knowledge of Spanish would allow her to overhear conversations that might reveal crucial intelligence. I don't like sending you into danger, Vikasa said as they prepared for what might be their last peaceful night together for some time. And I don't like the idea of sitting here waiting to be slaughtered, Helena replied with the fierce pragmatism that had carried her across a continent in search of a new life. Besides, I'm not the helpless victim Rodrigo thinks I am. I've learned a few things about taking care of myself. That night, as Sophia slept peacefully between them, Helena and Vikasa lay awake talking in whispers about tactics and contingencies, about escape routes and rendezvous points, about all the grim practicalities of people preparing for war. But underneath the military planning ran a deeper current of conversation, the kind of intimate sharing that happens when people think they might not have many more chances to speak the words that matter most. Tell me about your wife, Helena said during one of the quiet pauses in their strategic discussions. About Ayana. Vikasa was silent for so long that Helena thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful cadence of someone handling precious memories like fragile glass. She was everything I thought I needed, he said. Gentle, traditional, content with the old ways. When I came back from raids or negotiations with the whites, she would have food waiting and questions ready about our people's business. She made our lodge feel like the center of the world, the place where everything made sense. But she never challenged me. Never forced me to examine whether the choices I was making were right or just familiar. When the war came and I had to decide whether to follow Captain Jack into the lava beds or seek peace with the army, she supported whatever decision I made without question. Helena turned on her side to study his profile in the starlight filtering through the canyon opening. And you wanted her to question you? I wanted her to care enough about the outcome to have her own opinion, Vikasa said with painful honesty. I wanted to know that the woman I loved was strong enough to save me from my own mistakes. Is that what you want from me? Helena asked quietly. Someone to save you from your mistakes? Vikasa turned to face her, close enough in the darkness to see the reflection of stars in her eyes. I want someone who'll make her own mistakes and expect me to save her from them sometimes. I want someone who'll fight with me when I'm wrong and fight beside me when we're both right. Even if it means more danger, more complications. Especially if it means more danger and complications, Vikasa said with sudden fierceness. Safe love isn't love at all, it's just two people agreeing not to challenge each other's comfort. Helena was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what he was saying. When she spoke again, her voice carried a vulnerability that she rarely allowed herself to show. I was never safe with Miguel, she said, referring to Sophia's father for the first time since those early days of recovery. He loved me, but he loved his honor more. His duty to his heritage, his obligations to other men's expectations of what a husband should be. When he died, I grieved for him, But I also felt relieved. Relieved that I didn't have to spend the rest of my life being the woman he needed me to be, instead of the woman I actually was. What woman are you actually? Helena's laugh held no humor, only the hard-won self-knowledge of someone who had been forced to discover her own strength under fire. I'm the woman who'll put a knife in a man's back if he tries to hurt my daughter. I'm the woman who'll ride into a town full of enemies to gather intelligence that might save her family. I'm the woman who'll love a Modoc warrior so fiercely that it scares us both. The last words hung in the darkness between them, like a confession and a challenge combined. Vikasa felt his chest tighten with emotions he had thought were buried with his first family. Helena, I know it's too soon, she said quickly. I know we've only known each other for weeks, and I know this situation isn't exactly conducive to rational decision-making. But I also know that I've never felt with anyone else what I feel with you. And if tomorrow goes badly, if Rodrigo and his men manage to destroy what we've built here, I want you to know that these weeks have been the happiest of my life. Vikasa reached for her hand in the darkness, lacing their fingers together with gentle intensity. Mine too, he said simply. And that's why we're going to make sure tomorrow doesn't go badly. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the bitter necessity of separation. Helena prepared for her journey to Millbrook with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. She dressed in her cleanest clothes and braided her hair in a style that would help her blend in with the town's respectable women. She checked and rechecked the small pistol hidden in her skirts, rehearsed her cover story, and memorized the landmarks that would guide her safely back to the canyon. Sophia watched these preparations with the grave attention of a child who understood that something important and dangerous was happening. I want to come with you, she announced as Helena prepared to mount the paint horse. You need to stay here with Vikasa, Helena said gently but firmly. Help and prepare our defenses and watch for any signs of trouble. But what if something happens to you? What if the bad men catch you? Helena knelt down to Sophia's level, taking her daughter's small face in her hands with infinite tenderness. Then you stay with Vikasa, and you let him take care of you the way we've all been taking care of each other. Do you understand? Sophia's lower lip trembled, but she nodded with the courage that had carried her through everything else. I understand, Mama, but you have to promise to come back. I promise, Helena said, sealing the vow with a kiss to her daughter's forehead. Wild horses couldn't keep me away from you. Vikasa helped Helena into the saddle, his hands lingering on hers longer. Then strictly necessary. Be careful, he said quietly. Information isn't worth your life. My life isn't worth anything if we don't survive what's coming, Helena replied with stark honesty. I'll be back before sunset with everything we need to know. As the paint horse carried Helena toward the canyon entrance, Vikasa and Sophia stood together watching until she disappeared around the first bend in the passage. The canyon seemed immediately emptier without her presence, as if some essential element had been removed from their sanctuary. She'll be safe, won't she? Sophia asked, slipping her small hand into Vikasa's much larger one. Your mother is the strongest woman I've ever known, Vikasa said with complete conviction. And the smartest. If anyone can walk into danger and come back unharmed, it's her. But as the morning wore on and the canyon settled into an unnatural quiet, Vikasa found himself checking the passage entrance far more frequently than tactical necessity required. Helena had been gone for only hours, but already the place felt incomplete without her fierce presence and quick mind. He spent the day teaching Sophia to recognize the signs that would warn them of approaching riders, the way birds fell silent before humans entered their territory, the subtle changes in the wind patterns that indicated movement in the canyon's entrance passage, the different sounds that horses made, depending on whether their riders were cautious or confident. You're making me into a warrior, Sophia observed during one of these lessons. I'm making you into a survivor, Vikasa corrected. Warriors fight because they choose to. Survivors fight because they have to. Which one are you? The question made Vikasa pause in his demonstration of how to read tracks in soft sand. Which was he? A warrior who had chosen this fight, or a survivor who had been forced into it by circumstances beyond his control? I used to be a warrior, he said finally, fighting for my people's land, their right to live according to our traditions. But that war is over, and we lost. Now I'm something different. Now I'm a man fighting for his family. Is that better or worse than being a warrior? Different, Vikasa said thoughtfully. Warriors fight for abstract things, honor, territory, principle. Fathers fight for specific people. The motivation is smaller but more powerful. Sophia seemed to consider this distinction with the seriousness she brought to all adult concepts. When Mama comes back, will you marry her? The question caught Vikasa completely off guard. He had been expecting inquiries about tactics or weapons, not matrimonial speculation from an 8-year-old. Why do you ask? Because you look at her the way Papa used to look at her, Sophia said, with the observational skills that children develop when their survival depends on reading adult emotions accurately. And she looks at you the same way. And when people look at each other like that, they usually get married. Marriage is complicated, Vikasa said carefully, unsure how to explain the cultural and practical obstacles that lay between desire and reality. Everything important is complicated, Sophia replied with startling wisdom. That doesn't mean you don't do it. Before Vikasa could respond to this 8-year-old philosophy, the sound of a horse approaching at full gallop echoed through the canyon passage. He immediately pushed Sophia toward the shelter and reached for his rifle, but relaxed when he recognized the distinctive rhythm of the paint horse's gait. Helena emerged from the passage riding hard, her face flushed with exertion and her eyes bright with the kind of urgent energy that meant important news. She dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and was talking before her feet hit the ground. 8 men, she said without preamble. Rodrigo hired 6 gunfighters from as far away as Tucson, and they're planning to attack at dawn tomorrow. They think we're just a broken-down Indian and a helpless woman with a child. They're expecting this to be easy. What else? Vikasa asked, reading additional information in Alana's expression. They know about the canyon's entrance, but they don't know about the other way out, Helena said with grim satisfaction. The old hunting trail your people used to reach the high country. Rodrigo's informant in Millbrook only knew about the main passage. Sophia emerged from the shelter and ran to her mother, who swept her up in a fierce embrace that spoke of relief and determination combined. Did you have to hurt anyone? Sophia asked. No, Mia, Helena said gently. Sometimes the best fighting happens when nobody knows there's been a fight at all. As the 3 of them stood together in the canyon that had become their fortress and their home, the approaching storm felt different than it had that morning. Still dangerous, still potentially deadly, but no longer hopeless. They had intelligence, they had defensive advantages, and most importantly, they had each other. Tomorrow would bring the fight that would determine whether their fragile family could survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy anyone who dared to love across the boundaries of race, culture, and expectation. But tonight, they would plan and prepare and hold each other close, drawing strength from the knowledge that some things were worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. The canyon wall seemed to listen as they made their final preparations, as if the ancient spirits who had witnessed countless struggles for survival were adding their silent blessings to the battle that would soon determine whether love could triumph over hatred, whether mercy could overcome vengeance, and whether 3 people who had found each other against all odds could create a future together in a land that had already taken so much from all of them. The attack came not at dawn, as Helena had predicted, but in the deep heart of the night. when darkness was absolute and the canyon lay wrapped in deceptive silence. Rodrigo had proven more cunning than any of them anticipated, using the intelligence Helena had gathered against them by deliberately feeding false information to the sources he knew she would tap. Wicasa woke to the almost imperceptible sound of leather scraping against stone, whisper of movement that would have been lost to anyone whose survival hadn't depended on reading the desert's subtlest warnings. His hand found his rifle in the darkness while his mind instantly cataloged the implications of what his ears had detected. Someone was descending the canyon walls on ropes, bypassing the narrow entrance passage entirely and turning their greatest defensive advantage into a liability. He reached across the space between their sleeping areas and touched Helena's shoulder with gentle pressure that brought her instantly awake without a sound. Years of sleeping with one ear always listening. For Sophia's needs had given her the ability to transition from deep sleep to full alertness and heartbeats. "Company," he whispered against her ear, his breath barely disturbing the air between them. Multiple contacts, coming down the walls. Helena's response was wordless but immediate. She rolled towards Sophia's sleeping form and placed a hand over her daughter's mouth before gently shaking her awake. The child's eyes opened wide in the darkness, but she made no sound, the instincts that had kept her alive during their flight across the desert serving her well in this new crisis. Through the canyon's profound darkness, they could hear the subtle sounds of men attempting stealth, the faint clink of metal against stone, the whisper of rope sliding through carabiners, the careful placement of boots on uncertain footing. But there were other sounds too, coming from the direction of the main entrance. Rodrigo had split his forces, planning a coordinated assault from multiple directions that would leave them nowhere to run. How many? Helena breathed, her lips nearly touching Vicasa's ear. He closed his eyes and let his other senses paint a picture of their tactical situation. The sounds from above suggested at least 3 men rappelling down the canyon walls. The noises from the entrance passage indicated another group moving through the narrow defile with the careful precision of people who knew they held the advantage of surprise. 6, maybe 7, he whispered back. More than we planned for. In the darkness, Sophia's small hand found both of theirs, creating a moment of connection that grounded all 3 of them in what they were fighting to protect. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, they would face it as a family. Vicasa's mind raced through their prepared defensive plans, discarding each one as the changed circumstances rendered them useless. The carefully positioned firing points meant nothing if attackers were dropping from above. The escape route through the hidden passage would be cut off if enemies controlled both the canyon floor and the heights. Everything they had planned for had assumed a frontal assault through the main entrance, not this sophisticated pincer movement that spoke of military training and professional planning. New plan, he breathed, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had commanded men in battle. Helena, take Sophia to the sacred cave behind the waterfall. There's a passage there that leads to the high country too narrow for grown men but wide enough for you and her. What about you? Helena's voice carried fierce determination rather than fear. She wasn't asking because she planned to abandon him, but because she needed to understand his role in whatever desperate gambit he was formulating. I'm going to give you time to escape, Vicasa said with grim finality. And then I'm going to make sure they never threaten our family again. Helena's response was immediate and non-negotiable. No, we don't split up. We don't sacrifice anyone for the others. We find a way to survive together, or we don't survive at all. Before Vicasa could argue, the decision was taken from them. Rope dropped silently through the canyon, opening directly above their shelter, and a dark figure began descending with the fluid grace of someone who had done this many times before. In seconds, armed men would be in their living space, and all tactical advantages would belong to Rodrigo's forces. Vicasa moved with the lethal efficiency that had made him legendary during the Modoc War. His knife left its sheath in one fluid motion and buried itself to the hilt in the descending figure's thigh before the man could raise an alarm. The assassin's scream of pain and surprise echoed off the canyon walls like a war cry, shattering the night's silence and announcing to everyone involved that the battle had begun. "Now they know we're awake," Helena said with savage satisfaction, pulling Sophia toward the deeper shadows at the back of their shelter, while simultaneously drawing the pistol from her skirts. "Good, I'm tired of being hunted." The canyon erupted into chaos as Rodrigo's carefully orchestrated surprise attack devolved into a running firefight among the rocks and shadows. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly fireflies, and the confined space amplified every gunshot until the air itself seemed to ring with violence. Vicasa's wounded attacker had dropped his rifle when the knife found his leg, but he was drawing his sidearm with professional competence despite the pain. Helena's pistol spoke first, the bullet taking the man in the shoulder and spinning him around before he collapsed among the scattered remains of their peaceful domestic arrangements. "Two down," she called to Vicasa, who was already moving toward a better defensive position among the boulders that lined the canyon floor. "How many left?" "Too many," he replied, working the lever on his rifle as shapes moved in the darkness around them. "But they made a mistake coming into my territory." The truth of those words became apparent as Vicasa began using his intimate knowledge of the canyon's geography to deadly advantage. He moved through the familiar landscape like a ghost, appearing long enough to take precise shots before melting back into shadows that his enemies couldn't navigate without light. Each muzzle flash from their weapons revealed their positions, while his own shots came from darkness, guided by instincts honed through years of survival in hostile territory. But Rodrigo's men were professionals, and they adapted quickly to the changed circumstances. Instead of trying to match Vicasa's guerrilla tactics, they began using their numbers to control key positions, forcing him back toward the shelter where Helena and Sophia waited with diminishing cover. "Helena!" Rodrigo's voice echoed through the canyon with theatrical menace. "I know you can hear me, Puta. Send out the Indian and the brat, and maybe I'll let you live long enough to regret killing my brother." Helena's response was immediate and profane, delivered in Spanish that would have made a sailor blush. The general meaning was clear, even to those who didn't speak the language. Rodrigo could perform anatomically impossible acts upon himself before she would surrender anyone under her protection. "Have it your way," Rodrigo called back, and there was dark amusement in his voice. "Boys, burn them out." The smell of coal oil reached them before they saw the flames. Rodrigo's men had come prepared for siege warfare, carrying accelerants to force their quarry into the open. Fire began to blossom in multiple locations around the canyon floor, not random destruction, but carefully placed blazes designed to eliminate cover and funnel the defenders toward killing zones where superior numbers would decide the outcome. "They're trying to trap us," Sophia said with the matter-of-fact observation that had become her trademark in crisis situations, "like hunting rabbits." "Then we stop being rabbits," Helena replied grimly, checking the ammunition remaining in her pistol. "Vicasa, how do we get to higher ground?" "There's a path," he called back, taking the shot at a figure silhouetted against one of the fires. "But it's exposed. We'd be easy targets crossing open ground." "Then we make them too busy to shoot straight," Helena said, and there was something in her voice that made both Vicasa and Sophia look at her with new attention. Helena was no longer the grateful refugee who had accepted rescue with humble gratitude. She was no longer even the determined mother who had crossed a continent to build a new life for her daughter. In the dancing firelight of Rodrigo's arson, she had become something altogether more dangerous, a woman who had been pushed beyond the limits of patience and fear into the realm of cold, calculating fury. "Sophia, remember the story I told you about your grandmother during the war with the French?" Helena asked, her voice carrying an odd note of nostalgia despite their desperate circumstances. The one where she held off a whole company of soldiers while grandfather escaped with the wounded. Sophia replied, understanding immediately where her mother's thoughts were leading. That one. Sometimes running is the smartest choice, and sometimes running just gets you shot in the back. Helena turned to Vikasa with eyes that held the same deadly certainty he had seen in the faces of his most trusted warriors before hopeless battles. How much ammunition do you have left? Enough, he said simply, understanding that she was proposing something that went far beyond simple survival. Tactics. Good, because I'm tired of these men thinking they can terrorize women and children without consequences. I'm tired of running from bullies who mistake cruelty for strength. Helena's voice rose as she spoke, carrying clearly across the burning canyon, and I'm especially tired of listening to Rodrigo's voice. What followed was a masterpiece of tactical audacity that would have impressed military commanders on both sides of any conflict. Instead of seeking better defensive positions or attempting to escape through the hidden passages, Helena and Vikasa began moving toward their attackers with the coordinated precision of a team that had been fighting together for years, rather than weeks. Helena proved to be a revelation in combat, not just competent with her weapons, but possessed of an intuitive understanding of battlefield psychology that complemented Vikasa's tactical expertise. While he used the terrain and shadows to remain invisible, she used noise and movement to draw attention, creating false targets that pulled enemy fire away from Sophia's hiding place while positioning their attackers for Vikasa's increasingly deadly shots. She's moving. One of Rodrigo's men called out as Helena darted between burning obstacles with fluid grace. The woman's moving toward the north wall. Cut her off, Rodrigo commanded, and in that moment of redirected attention, Vikasa emerged from concealment directly behind two of the hired gunmen. His rifle spoke twice in rapid succession, and two more of their attackers joined their companions in whatever afterlife awaited. Men who made their living through violence. The tide of battle began to shift as Rodrigo realized that his carefully planned assault was becoming a slaughter of his own forces. The Indian he had dismissed as a broken-down hermit was systematically eliminating professional gunfighters with surgical precision. The helpless woman he had come to reclaim was moving through his battle lines like an avenging spirit, disrupting formations and creating chaos that his men couldn't adapt to quickly enough. Fall back, Rodrigo screamed, his voice cracking with frustrated rage. Regroup at the entrance. But falling back proved easier to order than to execute. Vikasa had spent 3 years learning every inch of the canyon's geography, and he used that knowledge to harass the retreating gunmen at every step. Helena, meanwhile, had circled around to cut off their retreat route, appearing at strategic moments to deliver precisely aimed shots that sent the survivors scrambling for cover that didn't exist. In less than 20 minutes, Rodrigo's 8-man assault force had been reduced to himself and 2 badly shaken hired guns who were beginning to question whether any amount of money was worth facing opponents who fought with this level of skill and determination. This isn't over, Rodrigo shouted from whatever rock he had found to hide behind. I'll bring the army. I'll bring federal marshals. I'll bring enough men to turn this whole canyon into a graveyard. You'll have to survive the night first, Vikasa called back, his voice carrying the cold certainty of a predator that had cornered its prey. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse among the burning canyon floor, with Rodrigo and his remaining men trying desperately to reach their horses while Vikasa and Helena methodically eliminated any chance of escape. The fires that had been meant to flush out their quarry now worked against Rodrigo's forces, providing light that revealed their movements while casting deeper shadows that concealed their pursuers. Sophia remained hidden in the sacred cave as instructed, but she could hear everything: the gunshots, the shouted commands, the screams of wounded men, and underneath it all, the deadly silence that followed each of Vikasa's precisely aimed shots. She was too young to understand the full tactical picture, but old enough to know that the balance of power had shifted decisively in their favor. The end came with sudden, brutal finality. Rodrigo, in his desperation to escape, made the fatal mistake of trying to climb the same rope his men had used to descend into the canyon. Helena's shot took him in the back as he reached for handholds on the canyon wall, and he fell 20 feet to land among the rocks with the wet sound of bones breaking beyond repair. His last two men, seeing their leader dead and their escape route cut off, threw down their weapons and called for mercy in voices that shook with terror and exhaustion. "Please," one of them called out, "we surrender. Don't kill us." Helena emerged from the shadows with her pistol trained on the surviving gunman, her face streaked with soot and her eyes bright with battle fury that hadn't yet begun to fade. "You came here to murder a woman and child," she said with deadly calm. "Give me one reason why you deserve to leave alive." "We were just hired guns," the second man pleaded. "This wasn't personal. We didn't know the whole story." "Ignorance isn't innocence," Vicasa said, appearing beside Helena with his rifle ready. "But mercy is sometimes stronger than justice." Helena looked at him with surprise, reading the message in his eyes. These men were broken, defeated, no longer a threat to anyone. Killing them now would be execution rather than self-defense, and that kind of killing left stains on the soul that never washed clean. "You have one chance," Helena told the survivors, her voice carrying absolute authority. "You ride out of here, and you never come back. You never mention this place, you never speak our names, and if I ever see either of your faces again, I'll kill you so slowly that you'll beg for the mercy I'm showing you now." The two men nodded frantically, gathering their wounded companion and stumbling toward the canyon entrance with the desperate haste of people who couldn't believe they were being allowed to live. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, the canyon fell into an unnatural quiet, broken only by the crackling of dying fires and the eternal murmur of running water. Helena and Vicasa stood together among the debris of battle, both of them trembling with the aftershock of violence survived and enemies defeated. "Is it over?" Sophia's voice called from the sacred cave, small and uncertain in the vast silence. "It's over, Mia," Helena called back, her voice breaking as the reality of their survival finally hit her. "Come out, you're safe now." Sophia emerged from hiding and ran to them, throwing her arms around both adults with the fierce relief of a child who had thought she might lose everything that mattered to her. As they held each other in the midst of their battle-scarred sanctuary, all three of them understood that something fundamental had changed in their relationship to each other and to the world beyond their canyon walls. They had fought for their family and won. They had faced impossible odds and emerged not just alive, but stronger than before. And in the process, they had discovered that love backed by courage and determination could triumph over hatred, greed, and violence, no matter how overwhelming the odds might seem. The canyon walls seemed to echo with the spirits of ancient warriors who had fought their own battles for survival and family in this same sacred space. But now, as Helena and Vicasa and Sophia stood together in the aftermath of their victory, those spirits were no longer the only ones who could claim this place as home. 6 months after the night that nearly destroyed everything they held dear, the hidden canyon had been reborn as something neither refuge nor fortress, but home in the truest sense of the word. The scars of battle remained bullet holes in the red rock walls, patches of earth where nothing would grow, where blood had soaked too deep, but the canyon had healed around those wounds, the way all living things heal when given time and care. And love, the garden plots had expanded threefold, terraced into the hillsides with engineering techniques that Vicasa had learned from his grandfather and Helena had refined with innovations born from her grandmother's farming wisdom. The shelter had grown into a proper house, built with adobe bricks mixed from canyon clay and reinforced with timber that Vicasa cut from the high country during his weekly hunting expeditions. Most remarkably, they were no longer alone. Word had spread through the scattered communities of displaced people who had been ground up by the machinery of westward expansion. These were people who had learned to recognize sanctuary when they found it, and they had found it in the canyon that Vikasa, Helena, and Sophia had defended with their lives. There was Chen Wei, the Chinese herbalist whose knowledge of desert plants complemented Vikasa's traditional medicine. Maria Santos, the elderly curandera who had attached herself to Helena like a grandmother claiming a long-lost granddaughter. James and Rebecca Morrison, former slaves from Georgia who had brought blacksmithing skills, and 2 teenage sons whose energy made even the hardest work feel like adventure. And there was Father Miguel Sandoval, the excommunicated priest whose crime had been ministering to Apache prisoners against his bishop's orders. He had arrived 3 months ago, hollow-eyed and spiritually shattered, carrying nothing but a worn Bible and a crisis of faith. What he had found was a community that operated on principles of redemption, forgiveness, and love. Here, people who had been discarded by the larger world were proving that families could be chosen rather than inherited, that communities could be built on shared values rather than shared blood. But today was different from all the days that had come before, because today Helena and Vikasa were getting married. "You're nervous," Sophia observed with devastating 9-year-old accuracy. She was helping her mother prepare for the ceremony, braiding wildflowers into Helena's hair with careful attention to detail. "Of course I'm nervous," Helena replied, checking her reflection in the polished metal mirror that Chen Wei had crafted as a wedding gift. "I'm about to promise to love one man for the rest of my life." "That's a big promise." "But you already love him," Sophia pointed out with irrefutable logic. "You've loved him since that first night when he carried us here. So really, you're just making official what's already true." Helena marveled at the wisdom that seemed to emerge from nowhere in moments like this. Sophia had grown 3 inches since their arrival, her face losing the pinched look of chronic worry. She moved with the confidence of a child who knew herself. To be loved and protected. "When did you become so wise about love?" Helena asked, pulling Sophia into an embrace that smelled of sage and sunshine. "From watching you and Vikasa," Sophia said simply. "You show each other love every day in 100 different ways. The ceremony is just how grown-ups announce to everyone else what children already know." A soft knock interrupted Helena's reflections. "Come in," she called, expecting Maria Santos with some last-minute ceremonial adjustment. Instead, Vikasa entered, and both Helena and Sophia gasped. He wore traditional Modoc ceremonial dress, an intricately beaded shirt made from soft deerskin, leggings decorated with porcupine quills and small silver bells, and a headdress of eagle feathers that spoke of honors earned through more than simple warfare. "You're not supposed to see the bride before the ceremony," Sophia protested weakly, though even she could see this moment transcended conventional rules. "I have something for your mother," Vikasa said, his voice carrying the weight of tradition. "Something that cannot wait for ceremonies." He held out a necklace unlike anything Helena had ever seen, a complex weaving of silver wire, turquoise stones, and small carved fetishes that seemed to capture light in impossible ways. More than its beauty, the necklace carried an aura of age and power that made their adobe house feel suddenly too small. "This belonged to my grandmother," Vikasa said, emotion thick in his voice, "and to her grandmother before her. It has been worn by the women of my family for 7 generations, passed down through times of peace and war, abundance and famine, joy and sorrow." Helena stared at the necklace, understanding immediately what he was offering. Not just jewelry, but lineage. Not just adornment, but ancestry. Not just a gift, but adoption into a heritage stretching back through centuries of survival and wisdom. "Vikasa." "I can't," she whispered. "I'm not Modoc. I don't have the right." "You have the right I give you," he interrupted gently. "You have the right that comes from choosing to stand with my people's ways, when standing alone would have been easier. You have the right that comes from defending this sacred place with your blood and courage." He moved behind her, lifting her hair to fasten the necklace around her throat. Its weight was surprisingly heavy, but it settled against her skin as if made specifically for her. "My grandmother told me this necklace would know its next owner," Vikasa continued, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "She said when the right woman appeared, the stones would sing." Helena looked down and gasped. The turquoise stones were indeed singing, not audibly, but with a vibration she could feel through her skin. A harmonic resonance connecting her to generations of women who had worn these same stones while facing their own challenges and celebrations. "Do you hear it too?" she asked Sophia, who stared at the necklace with wide eyes. "I see it," Sophia said quietly. "The stones are glowing." A soft blue-green radiance pulsed in rhythm with Helena's heartbeat, as if the necklace was synchronizing itself with her life force. "It's magic," Sophia whispered. "It's love," Vikasa corrected gently. "Love accumulated over generations and concentrated into something that can be passed on. The magic is in the caring, not the stones." The ceremony itself was unlike anything any of them had ever witnessed. They gathered in the natural amphitheater formed by the canyon's widest point, where the stream created small waterfalls and red rock walls rose like cathedral spires toward the endless desert sky. "Father," Sandoval spoke about love as the fundamental force connecting all living things. About marriage as a sacrament that existed wherever two people chose to bind their lives together in service to something larger than themselves. Maria Santos conducted the curandera blessings with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, mixing herbs and smoke and ancient words that made the very air around Helena and Vikasa shimmer with possibility. She spoke of Helena as a daughter returned from a long journey, of Vikasa as a son who had finally found his way home, but it was Vikasa's portion that brought everything into focus. Speaking first in Modoc, then switching to English, he called on his ancestors' spirits to witness this moment, to accept Helena and Sophia into the eternal circle of family. "In our tradition," he said, "marriage is not just the union of two people, but the joining of two streams that flow together to create something new while honoring everything that has come before." Helena brings the strength of her Mexican heritage, the wisdom of her grandmother's teachings, the fierce love that carried her and Sophia across impossible distances to find safety. He turned to Sophia, who stood beside them wearing a miniature version of the traditional dress Maria Santos had sewn for Helena. "And Sophia brings the promise of the future, the reminder that our love exists not just for its own sake, but to create a world where children can grow up safe and loved and free to become whatever their spirits call them to be." When formal vows were complete, Chunwei presented them with wedding rings he had forged from silver ore found in the canyon's heights, engraved with symbols blending Chinese characters for long life and prosperity, with Modoc pictographs representing home and family. The most moving moment came when the entire community joined hands around the newlywed couple and Sophia, creating a circle representing their commitment, not just to the marriage, but to the radical experiment in multicultural family building they had all chosen to support. "We promise," Father Sandoval said, speaking for the group, "to honor this marriage as a foundation stone of our community. We promise to support Helena and Vikasa in their life together, to help raise Sophia as our collective daughter, and to defend this family as we would defend our own lives." As the sun set behind canyon walls, painting the sky in gold and crimson that seemed to bless the day's proceedings, Helena found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been a widow fleeing across the desert with nothing but her daughter and desperate hope. Today, she was surrounded by people who had chosen to love her, married to a man who understood her complexity and cherished her strength, wearing a necklace connecting her to 7 generations of wise women. "Any regrets?" Vikasa asked as they stood together watching their chosen family Celebrate around cooking fires that turned the canyon into a wonderland of dancing shadows and warm light. Only one, Helena replied, leaning into his embrace with perfect trust. I regret that it took us so long to find each other. Sophia appeared at their side, her face smudged with wedding cake that Rebecca Morrison had somehow managed to bake in. A Dutch oven over an open fire. Can I call you Papa now? She asked Vikasa with characteristic directness. I've been hoping you would, Vikasa replied, kneeling to bring himself to her eye level. But only if you want to. I know you still love your first Papa, and I would never want to replace him in your heart. There's room for both, Sophia said with the wisdom of someone who had learned early that love multiplied rather than divided, when freely given. Papa Miguel will always be my first Papa, but you're my now Papa. The one who takes care of me and Mama and keeps us safe. As night settled over the canyon and celebration evolved into storytelling around the central fire, Helena realized they had accomplished something remarkable. They had taken broken pieces of their separate lives and assembled them into something whole and beautiful and strong. They had proven that families could be chosen, that communities could be built on principles of mutual aid and respect, that love could triumph over hatred if people were willing to fight for it with intelligence, courage, and unwavering commitment. Necklace around her throat pulsed gently with accumulated generations of love and wisdom, reminding her that she was now part of something larger than her individual story. She was a link in an unbroken chain of women who had faced impossible odds and somehow found ways to not just survive, but to create life and beauty and hope in the midst of chaos. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were always new challenges. In a world that seemed determined to test the resolve of anyone who dared to love across boundaries of race, culture, and convention. But tonight, surrounded by people who had chosen to call her family, married to the man who had taught her that home was not a place, but a collection of people willing to fight for each other's happiness, Helena allowed herself to believe they had built something strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. The canyon walls echoed with laughter and music and the sound of children playing games that blended traditions from 4 different cultures. And in that sound, Helena heard the future not perfect, not easy, but full of the kind of hope that makes all struggles worthwhile. As Vikasa's arms tightened around her, and Sophia curled up against both of them to listen to Chun Wei tell stories about dragons and heroes, Helena understood that she had finally found what she had been searching for since the day she fled Texas with nothing but her daughter and a dream of something better. She had found home. Not just a place, but a people. Not just safety, but sanctuary. Not just survival, but the kind of life worth the risks they had taken to claim it. And in the sacred canyon where ancient spirits blessed modern love, 3 souls who had been lost, in different ways celebrated this simple miracle of having found each other against odds that should have been impossible to overcome. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, and the desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility. Tomorrow would write new chapters in their ongoing story. But tonight was perfect, exactly as it was a moment when love had triumphed. Family had been chosen, and hope had proven stronger than fear. In the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.